Did you know that a single conspiracy, during one of the most turbulent times in Roman history, forever changed the fate of the empire? Imagine a man at the height of power, betrayed by those he trusted most. But what happens when the death of an emperor is not just an end, but the beginning of a plot that echoes through generations? Get ready to discover what led to the unforgivable death of Claudius, and how this shocking event forever altered the history of Rome. The answer might be more surprising than you think. Stay with me until the end, and see how a conspiracy masterminded in the shadows sparked one of the most intense chapters of the Roman Empire. The night draped Rome in a cloak of mystery. The imperial palace, despite its grandeur, exuded an invisible tension, as if the marble columns themselves felt the weight of the secrets echoing through its halls. Claudius, the man no one expected to become emperor, now found himself at the center of a conspiracy that would change Rome's fate forever. That evening's banquet was like any other. Servants came and went, pouring wine into golden goblets, while the nobles toasted beneath the flickering torchlight. Claudius, already an aged and frail man, failed to notice the subtle glances exchanged between those seated near him. Agrippina, his wife and niece, maintained a serene expression, but her sharp eyes followed every movement of her husband. She was waiting, and when the right moment came, a servant glided up to him, bringing a tray with refined delicacies. At the center of the dish were mushrooms, the emperor's favorites. Since his youth, Claudius had enjoyed them, and it had become a habit to savor them without hesitation. But these mushrooms were not ordinary. They were soaked in poison, carefully prepared by Xenophon, his trusted doctor, a man who, at that very moment, had stopped being his healer and had become his executioner. The first sign was subtle, a slight discomfort in his stomach, easily mistaken for indigestion. But then came the pain, growing in waves, tightening his chest and making his breathing irregular. Claudius tried to speak, but his voice came out strangled, as if his very throat was betraying him. His gaze searched for help around him, but the servants remained still, like living statues. No gestures of aid, no signs of alarm. Everything was unfolding as planned. Agrippina watched intently, calculating every second. But something unexpected happened. The poison did not act as quickly as it should. Claudius did not die immediately. He trembled, salivated, emitted disconnected sounds. His eyes, once sharp at detecting conspiracies, were now clouded by the fog of impending death. Distressed, Agrippina realized a final blow was necessary. They called for Xenophon, who, with the coldness of a man used to serving power, decided to hasten the inevitable. Under the pretext of helping him expel the poison, the doctor inserted a feather into his throat, forcing him to vomit. But the feather, soaked in an even more toxic substance, sealed his fate. The emperor, now too weak to fight, finally succumbed. The palace fell into silence. By dawn, the news spread through the streets of Rome. Claudius was dead. The citizens, accustomed to sudden shifts in power, received the news with resignation. But in the halls of the Senate and the barracks of the Praetorian Guard, the wheels of the future were already turning. The senators did not mourn his passing. Claudius had always been an intruder in power, a leader imposed by the soldiers, not by the political will of the aristocracy. The Praetorian Guard, who were supposed to protect the emperor, did not lift a finger to prevent his death. They knew that with Nero's ascension, their privileges would be preserved. And so, in a meticulously orchestrated conspiracy, Rome changed rulers once again. But what no one knew was that, by handing the throne to Nero, they were opening the doors to one of the most chaotic periods in the empire's history. Decades before his tragic death, no one would have imagined that Claudius would one day rule Rome. From birth, he seemed destined for oblivion. Born in 10 BC, the son of Nero Claudius Drusus and Antonia Minor, he was a member of the prestigious Julio-Claudian dynasty, but his childhood was far from the shine and glory expected of an imperial descendant. From a young age, Claudius faced challenges that set him apart from the rest of his family. He had uncontrollable spasms, limped when walking, and his speech was halting, marked by a persistent stutter. In a society that valued strength and physical perfection, his limitations were seen as a sign of weakness. His own mother, Antonia, despised his existence. She called him monstrum, a monster, a mistake of nature. His grandfather, the feared Emperor Augustus, avoided prolonged contact with the boy, considering him unworthy of any prominent role. Only his grandmother Livia, Augustus's wife, showed some patience, but only to mock him during moments of boredom. In his youth, Claudius was relegated to live in the shadow of other members of the imperial family. While his brother Germanicus grew up surrounded by admiration and grand expectations, Claudius was kept away from public life, considered a shameful burden for the Julio-Claudians. Even Tiberius, his uncle and future emperor, avoided mentioning him, as if acknowledging his existence was an embarrassment to the dynasty. The early years of his life were marked by isolation and humiliation. When he attended family events, relatives would laugh at his mannerisms and murmur that he would never be of use to Rome. In the eyes of the world, Claudius was nothing but a pitiable figure, an unwanted member of a powerful lineage, destined to fade into irrelevance. But in the silence of the corridors where he was forgotten, Claudius found an unexpected refuge. If he could not be respected for his appearance or military skills, he would devote himself to something no one could take away from him: knowledge. And so, while Rome ignored his existence, Claudius immersed himself in studies, unaware that fate still had a twist in store for him. As he grew, Claudius realized he could never compete with his relatives in physical strength or political charisma. But if there was something no one could take from him, it was his mind. While other members of the dynasty occupied themselves with banquets, games, and intrigues, he took refuge in books. The great historians and thinkers of Greece and Rome became his true companions. He studied Thucydides and Herodotus with fervor, absorbing the lessons of the past like a warrior sharpening his blade before battle. His interest was not limited to history. He delved into rhetoric, philosophy, law, and even Etruscology, becoming one of the few Romans of his time to understand the Etruscan culture. His brilliant intellect, however, was often ridiculed. To the Roman elite, Claudius was merely an eccentric academic, a reclusive scholar who posed no threat to power. Even his own nephew, the arrogant Caligula, amused himself by mocking his awkwardness and obsession with books, treating him like a harmless fool. But this mistaken perception turned out to be his greatest advantage. While the emperors and senators of the time destroyed themselves in conspiracies and betrayals, Claudius remained on the sidelines, unnoticed, accumulating knowledge and developing a sharp eye for the machinery of Roman politics. He wrote extensively on the history of Rome, leaving critical analyses of the governments that preceded him. His detailed insights into the rise and fall of leaders showed that he understood something few perceived. Power was not only maintained by force, but also by cunning and control of the narrative. Without anyone noticing, that man considered weak and irrelevant was acquiring the tools that would one day help him survive the most lethal game in Rome. But Claudius still did not know that, at the right moment, his underestimated intelligence would become his greatest weapon. If books taught Claudius the lessons of the past, the reality of Rome showed him the cruelties of the present. The empire was not governed solely by laws and senators, but by an unrelenting game of betrayals, ambition, and power. Even without holding prominent political positions, Claudius observed the behind-the-scenes workings of the government. He saw how emperors ascended to the throne surrounded by promises and fell under the weight of conspiracies. The Senate, theoretically a respectable institution, was full of men who traded alliances like merchants negotiating in the Forum. Loyalty was just a currency, and betrayal a shortcut to power. Claudius's own family was immersed in this turmoil. His uncle Tiberius became emperor, but ruled increasingly isolated, relying on spies and executioners. Then came Caligula, the nephew who turned Rome into his personal stage of cruelty and madness. Claudius saw senators flatter the young emperor one day and conspire against him the next. All of this led Claudius to develop a sharp instinct for politics, even though he wasn't actively involved in it. He learned that survival depended on patience, discretion, and the ability to adapt. He realized that, for a man like him, seen as weak and irrelevant, the greatest danger wasn't being hated, but being noticed too much. While the big players of power devoured each other, Claudius stayed on the sidelines, studying their moves, waiting without rush. Rome's political world was an arena where the strong fell due to their own arrogance. And Claudius, considered fragile by everyone, was about to become the greatest survivor of all. The death of Caligula was a shock to Rome, a murdered emperor in an instant of chaos. But for those watching closely, this moment of destruction opened an unexpected path. The empire was aimless. The streets of Rome still echoed with the blood that had been spilled, and no one knew who could be the next to take the throne. The Senate was lost, with no clear leader, and the Praetorian Guard, which always held power in times of crisis, sought someone who could ensure their loyalty while maintaining stability in the empire. In this scenario of disorder, Claudius, the man always ignored, found his chance. Hidden in the shadows of the imperial palace, he stayed away from power struggles, but on that day, he became the key to avoiding a civil war. When the imperial guards stormed the palace after Caligula's assassination, no one expected the crisis response to be so unlikely. Among the shadows of the palace, Claudius, known for his clumsy appearance and hesitant speech, was found. He was scared but knew what was at stake. What he didn't know was that the Praetorian Guard, hungry for stability and rewards, would recognize him as the only safe option. At first, Claudius' appointment seemed like a mistake. He was seen as a weak man, someone who would never have the ability to control the empire. However, what few saw was that his harmless appearance had become his greatest advantage. The Roman elite didn't fear Claudius because they saw him as a puppet easy to manipulate. This, however, gave him the freedom to govern in his own way, without the burden of expectations and political intrigues that consumed other emperors. Claudius' appointment wasn't the choice of a strong man, but of an invisible man. He wasn't a threat to anyone, which, in Roman politics, was exactly what he needed to survive. So Claudius accepted the throne, not with an air of grandeur, but with the determination of a man who knew that opportunity was knocking at his door. He would become an unexpected emperor, but against all odds, he might just be the leader Rome needed. And by taking power, he was about to show the world that sometimes the underestimated can change history in ways no one could imagine. The Praetorian Guard was undoubtedly the real power in Rome, or at least, that's what many believed. The military elite, composed of elite soldiers and the emperor's guards, had more power on the streets of Rome than any senator or magistrate. They were the ones who decided who would rise to the throne, and their loyalty was more valuable than any Roman army. When Caligula was assassinated, the Praetorians, as always, had the final say on the future of the empire. But who could have imagined that they would choose Claudius, the man everyone considered a political joke? The truth was that, after Caligula's brutal death, the Praetorian Guard sought an emperor who could guarantee the continuity of the system of privileges that greatly favored them. The empire was in absolute chaos, and the last thing the Praetorians wanted was a civil war. They knew that, in times of instability, the empire could easily fragment, and the possibility of an internal fight between the different Roman factions could be fatal for everyone. The choice of Claudius was then a pragmatic move. He was above all predictable and controllable. When the soldiers found Claudius hiding in the palace, he seemed like the safest choice, the ideal emperor to ensure that the Praetorian Guard didn't lose their privileges and that the city remained intact. Claudius, aware of his position, didn't hesitate to win the loyalty of the Praetorians with generous promises of pay raises. He knew that, to maintain power, he needed the Guard on his side. With this move, Claudius consolidated his position. He wasn't the leader of a victorious army or the hero of a great empire, but he was the leader of the force that truly controlled Rome. From that moment on, his survival on the throne was guaranteed, not by his strong rule or natural authority, but by the power of those who could overthrow any emperor in the blink of an eye. However, Claudius wasn't naive. He knew that the Praetorian Guard's loyalty wasn't eternal. A new faction could always emerge, a new leader who, stronger or more ambitious, could threaten his reign. But for now, he had what he needed: control of the military power. So, he began to build his base of support, not only with the Praetorians, but also with those who saw in the emperor a chance for stability in an empire that had long lost its way. Even though Claudius had secured the support of the Praetorian Guard and guaranteed his position on the throne, he couldn't ignore the internal resistance that was emerging from another essential part of the empire: the Senate. The Roman elite, represented by the senators, looked down on Claudius. They didn't consider him a true emperor, someone chosen for his intelligence, strength, or political skill. To them, Claudius was an accident, a man who had never been prepared to rule, but who, by chance, became the leader of Rome. His rise had not received the Senate's approval, and this was clear from the very first day of his reign. Claudius knew that, without the support of the senators, his rule would be weak, lacking legitimacy in the eyes of the Roman elite. However, he also understood that he needed to act skillfully to earn their respect. It would be of no use to force a direct alliance, as that would only create more distrust and resistance. So he followed a strategy that many would consider bold: to remove those senators who were notoriously corrupt, unpopular, and disloyal to his authority, replacing them with new members from the provincial elite. This not only reformed the Senate, but also reshaped the power dynamics within the ruling class. This approach aligned with the tensions that already existed among Rome's senators. Claudius didn't hesitate to act against those who undermined his authority, removing them from the political scene whenever necessary. However, his attitude of distancing himself from the old senators and opening space for a new elite didn't mean he didn't try to win back those who remained loyal to the old system. Claudius tried to maintain a balance, encouraging the loyalty of the most influential senators while also implementing his administrative reforms. Though his government was effective, Claudius never managed to completely eliminate the resistance from the Senate. The Senate never accepted the fact that a man, seen as incapable and a political outsider, had become the emperor of Rome. They looked at him with distrust, fearing that his actions would deliver a blow to the already fragile power structure. Claudius found himself in a minefield, in a position where, no matter how much he wanted to establish his own rule and consolidate reforms, he was constantly being challenged by the old guard of Roman politics. The relationship between the emperor and the Senate was a constant game of tension. Claudius, on one hand, tried to please the senators and show that his administration was aimed at the good of the empire. But on the other hand, he knew he would never be fully accepted by those who saw his rise as a scandal and a mistake. This made his reign marked by an invisible struggle for legitimacy, a constant battle to assert himself as emperor in the eyes of the Roman elite, even though his true power lay elsewhere, in military support and the trust of the people. The Roman Empire, with its vast size and complexity, required highly efficient administration to remain cohesive. When Claudius took the throne, he found an empire marked by administrative failures, corruption, and ineffective bureaucracy. Amid this chaos, he saw an opportunity not only to strengthen his rule, but also to leave his mark on Roman history. What Claudius did next was nothing short of an administrative revolution, though not everyone recognized it at the time. Claudius began a series of reforms aimed at correcting the shortcomings of the imperial system. He started with creating a new tax collection system, aiming to make it fairer and more efficient. At a time when the collection system was saturated with abuse and fraud, he established a network of supervisors to monitor tax collection more rigorously. The goal was to eliminate corrupt middlemen and ensure that the empire's money was better distributed to support the armies, fund public works, and of course, sustain the empire itself. Additionally, Claudius did something that many thought unthinkable. He reformed Rome's legal system, giving greater access to the common people and provincials. Until then, the Roman legal system had been dominated by senators and elites, who often used the law as a tool to protect their own interests. Claudius, aware of this, created new laws that allowed ordinary citizens more chances to present their cases in court, creating a more inclusive system, less susceptible to external influences. The bureaucracy also underwent a major transformation. Claudius sought to better organize the provincial administrations, creating a network of loyal governors who would be responsible for directly implementing the new policies in the provinces. These governors did not come from traditional Roman families, but were chosen based on their competence and administrative skills. This not only made the government more efficient, but also helped stabilize provinces that had often been on the brink of revolt due to corrupt rulers' neglect. Even more impressive was his ability to fight corruption within the government. Although the empire was vast and filled with diverging interests, Claudius took strict measures to identify and remove those who were manipulating the system for personal gain. His administration came to be seen as a model of efficiency compared to previous rulers, and many believed he had, in fact, given a new lease on life to the administrative structure of Rome. However, Claudius' reforms did not come without resistance. Those who benefited from the old system of corruption tried to sabotage his initiatives, creating obstacles and secret alliances to undermine his authority. But Claudius stood firm. Even though he lacked the military strength of a great general or the charisma of other emperors, he used his administrative intelligence to ensure his government succeeded. While many of these reforms were essential for the empire's stability, they also showcased Claudius' true skill as a leader, not through epic battles or great military conquests, but through his ability to transform the internal structure of Rome, making it more efficient and accessible. This was undoubtedly one of Claudius' greatest legacies, and proof that, despite the adversities, he possessed a deep understanding of how to govern a vast and complex empire. In 43 AD, the Roman Empire was in full expansion, and Claudius knew he needed to consolidate Roman power in new lands. Britain, a wild region filled with warrior tribes, still resisted Rome's authority. For many Romans, the idea of conquering the distant island seemed audacious, but Claudius, who had already proven himself a shrewd leader, saw it as an opportunity to make a lasting historical mark on his reign. The conquest of Britain would not just be a military victory, but also a way to enhance Rome's prestige, and especially his own prestige as emperor. The decision to invade Britain was not made impulsively. Claudius carefully planned the campaign, sending a large, well-trained, and well-supplied army to cross the English Channel. The Roman commander, Aulus Claudius, was tasked with leading the legions, but Claudius, to ensure the success of the mission, decided to join the expedition personally. It was uncommon for an emperor to directly participate in military campaigns, but this was a strategic move by Claudius to show his leadership and courage. A way to ensure his authority was firmly recognized, even by his soldiers. The crossing of the Channel and the arrival of the Roman legions in British territory was a decisive moment. The Romans faced fierce resistance from the local tribes, but the discipline and training of the Roman forces prevailed. The British tribes, although warlike, were disorganized and at war with each other, which made it easier for the invaders. Claudius, with great insight, knew how to negotiate with some tribes and used a combination of military force and diplomatic strategies to secure a quick victory. After a series of intense battles and successful sieges, the Romans took the major cities and fortifications of Britain. Claudius, not content with just the military victory, personally traveled to Britain to mark the event as a great conquest. His presence on enemy territory was a spectacle of power and symbolism. When he arrived on the island, he was welcomed with a grand Roman celebration, and he made sure to appear alongside his generals, highlighting his role as the leader of the campaign. This action was not just a simple territorial conquest, but a brilliant political move. By invading Britain, Claudius consolidated his power both internally and externally. Within the empire, he earned the respect and admiration of the soldiers and the Roman people, who saw him as an emperor capable of achieving great feats. Outside of Rome, the victory ensured that the Romans had a new province, rich in natural resources and with great strategic potential. The conquest of Britain also served as a symbol that the Roman Empire was not just expanding eastward or southward, but was taking control of lands beyond the known horizon. The impact of this conquest was profound, and Claudius made sure to build colonies and fortresses in British territory to ensure the new province was stabilized and integrated into the empire. He founded new cities, including Camulogenum, modern-day Colchester, which would become the Roman capital of Britain. The colonization project was one of the greatest of his reign, and the Roman presence in Britain was solidified with the construction of roads, fortifications, and aqueducts, typical features of Roman administration. The victory in Britain also increased Claudius' military prestige, strengthening his position as emperor. He managed to combine military victories with his image as a competent and respected ruler. Therefore, the conquest of Britain was not only one of Claudius' greatest military achievements, but also a landmark of his political and administrative skill. It represented the ability of an underestimated emperor to take Rome to a new level of greatness, and ensured that his rise to power was, at least for a time, recognized and celebrated by all of Rome. The victory in Britain was just the beginning of a series of conquests that defined Claudius' reign. With the power of the empire increasingly consolidated and his popularity on the rise, the emperor turned his attention to other regions that were still outside Roman control. Not satisfied with the victories already achieved, he sought to expand Rome's borders even further, solidifying his position not just as a ruler, but as a true architect of the empire. The emperor knew that Rome's stability depended on the security and expansion of its borders, and it was with this goal in mind that he looked beyond Britain. Claudius' campaigns were not limited to the island, but extended to other regions of the empire. Germania, a mystical land full of warrior tribes, and Thrace, with its strategic importance, were among the next areas Claudius planned to integrate into the empire. In each of these campaigns, the emperor demonstrated not only his military leadership, but also his vision for Rome's future. In Germania, Claudius continued consolidating Roman presence, pressuring local tribes that resisted Rome's rule. The region was known for its fierce resistance and the difficulty of controlling the densely forested lands. However, the Roman army, with its well-defined strategies and disciplined legions, was able to weaken the Germanic tribes and establish forts along the Rhine River, creating a natural barrier for future invasions. Although the region was far from fully pacified, Claudius' actions there had a significant impact and laid the foundation for Roman dominance in the area. Meanwhile, in Thrace and Mauritania, Claudius continued to expand the empire's borders. In Thrace, the Romans faced challenges similar to those in Germania, with local tribes opposing imperial rule. However, Claudius skillfully combined Roman military power with diplomacy and strategic alliances with other nations to ensure victory. Thrace was annexed into the empire as a province, and Roman rule was strengthened with the construction of cities and fortifications throughout the region, securing control over trade routes and areas close to the Black Sea. Mauritania, located in North Africa, also fell under Roman control during Claudius' reign. While not as strategically important as other conquered regions, Mauritania offered valuable resources and was crucial for the security of the empire's borders. Claudius, with his keen eye for detail, recognized Mauritania's potential and ordered its annexation. He established colonies and forts, further expanding Roman presence in North Africa. Claudius' expansion of the Roman Empire was not limited to military conquest, but also to creating a more cohesive and interconnected empire. The new provinces were integrated into the Roman system with the construction of infrastructure such as roads, aqueducts, and defense systems, which helped maintain order and facilitated trade between distant provinces. The newly conquered cities flourished under Roman administration, offering new economic, political, and social opportunities for Roman citizens and the conquered peoples. Claudius was not just a military conqueror, but also a shrewd administrator, able to consolidate victories and ensure peace and prosperity within the empire's new borders. Under his leadership, Rome expanded even further, solidifying its position as the most powerful and influential empire in the ancient world. The vast territorial expansion of Claudius is often overshadowed by his involvement in court intrigues and the challenges of governing a Rome full of conspiracies. However, it is impossible to ignore the lasting impact he had on the formation of the empire, and his legacy remains a testament to the vision and determination of an emperor who, despite being underestimated by many, succeeded in transforming Rome into an even more formidable and indomitable power. Claudius was not just a conqueror or a political leader. He was also a visionary when it came to the development of Rome and its provinces. He understood that in order to maintain the empire's power and stability, it was not enough to simply expand its borders or conquer distant lands. A robust infrastructure system was needed to connect the provinces, facilitate trade, and ensure the efficiency of government. His strategic approach to the development of Rome and its provinces marked an era of great progress in the empire's history. During his reign, Claudius made significant investments in infrastructure projects, focusing on aqueducts, sewage systems, and transport routes. These projects were not just luxuries for an expanding city, but fundamental investments to ensure the empire's longevity. In a growing Rome, with its constantly increasing population, managing water and public health became essential to maintain order and the well-being of its citizens. Aqueducts, in particular, were one of Claudius' greatest legacies. Although the Romans had a history of building aqueducts, Claudius expanded this system impressively. He ordered the construction of the Aqua Claudia and Annio Novus, two massive aqueducts that brought water from distant sources to the city. These projects not only improved Rome's water supply, but also demonstrated the empire's ability to mobilize resources and technology to solve complex urban problems. In addition to the aqueducts, Claudius also worked to improve Rome's sewer system. He renovated the famous Cloaca Maxima, one of the largest and oldest sewer systems in the ancient world, allowing the city of Rome to continue growing without worrying about the sanitation problems that could threaten public health. This attention to health infrastructure was one of many ways Claudius sought to ensure his citizens' well-being, something vital in such a populous metropolis with immense logistical challenges. Roads, as always, were one of the pillars of the Roman Empire, and Claudius did not neglect this essential need. During his reign, he began building new routes connecting various provinces of the empire, as well as expanding and improving existing roads. These roads facilitated the movement of Roman legions, trade between provinces, and communication within the empire. In such a vast empire, ensuring that troops could move quickly and that merchants could transport goods without difficulty was crucial for maintaining order and prosperity. But Claudius' projects were not limited to logistics and urban infrastructure. He also initiated a series of initiatives to improve the distribution of food, particularly grain, in Rome. The city, with its enormous population, relied heavily on imports to feed its inhabitants, and any failure in this system could lead to a devastating famine. Claudius took measures to ensure a constant supply of food, building new warehouses and expanding the grain distribution system to the city. Claudius' efforts to improve infrastructure extended beyond the capital to the provinces. Throughout his reign, he ensured that the empire's more distant provinces, such as Britain, had access to infrastructure improvements, which helped integrate these newly conquered regions into the Roman system. Fortresses were built to defend the borders, while new cities and trade centers flourished under Roman administration. While many Roman emperors prioritized war or luxury, Claudius stood out for his emphasis on making Rome and its provinces more functional and sustainable. He understood that without a solid foundation, the Roman Empire could not be maintained. Claudius' investments in infrastructure helped transform Rome into an even grander and more efficient city, and his legacy endures today, visible in many of the structures he ordered to be built, which still stand as testaments to his reign. His keen eye for detail and his dedication to making the empire more functional and connected were defining characteristics of his rule. If the aqueducts, roads, and sewer systems of Rome were the foundation upon which he built the stability of his city, Rome's greatness depended on how he envisioned the empire as a whole, as an interconnected organism, capable of withstanding the external and internal forces that might threaten its dominion. At the center of Claudius' government was a deep understanding of the Roman people and the needs of the lower classes. While the aristocratic elite viewed him with suspicion and disdain, the emperor knew that the stability of the empire depended on the loyalty of the masses. He recognized that in times of crisis, the population could be the key to maintaining order and control. For this reason, he made sure to cultivate a good relationship with the lower classes, implementing policies and practices designed to secure popular support. One of Claudius' first actions was to promote a government that was more accessible to the plebeians, something that contrasted with the previous styles of emperors from the Julio-Claudian dynasty. He knew that, to ensure the stability of his reign, he could not limit himself to pleasing the senators or the wealthy. Rome, with its immense and growing population, required that the emperor be able to maintain peace among the different social classes. Claudius did not hesitate to use his position to provide direct benefits to those who truly sustained the city, the common citizens. One of his most effective strategies was the distribution of food. Rome was a city with over 1 million inhabitants, and ensuring the plebeians had access to food was crucial to avoid riots and revolts. To this end, Claudius created and expanded the grain distribution system, making it more accessible and reducing the cost for the poorer citizens. Additionally, he implemented a system of public warehouses where grains were stored and distributed, a form of centralized control that helped mitigate the effects of poor harvests or external crises. Public games also became an important tool for winning the support of the people. In Rome, games were not only a form of entertainment, but also an opportunity for the emperor to demonstrate his generosity and concern for the plebeians. Claudius organized grand events, such as chariot races and gladiatorial combats, which were seen as a way to offer pleasure and relieve the tensions of the population. He understood the symbolic power of these events and how they could strengthen his image with the people. But it wasn't just food and entertainment that won Claudius the popular support. He also worked to establish a more accessible and just legal system for Roman citizens. Throughout his reign, he created new laws and administrative reforms that made it easier for the plebeians to access justice. The emperor sought to reduce corruption in the courts and ensured that the grievances of the lower classes were heard. This increased people's trust in his government and showed that Claudius was willing to promote greater equity within the empire. His efforts to reach out to the plebeians were not limited to the large cities like Rome. He also cared for the provinces, where the relationship with Roman authorities was not always harmonious. Claudius sought to give voice to the provincials, allowing them greater access to administrative positions and the military. He sought to incorporate provincial elites into the Roman system, aiming to reduce tensions between Rome and the more distant regions of the empire. Despite the challenges and resistance from many senators who saw these actions as populist or dangerous to the status quo, Claudius remained firm in his belief that the empire could only prosper if there was a solid relationship with the plebeians. He knew his position was fragile and that the Roman elite did not fully trust his leadership. Therefore, he focused on a strategy that strengthened his base of support among the common people, ensuring they saw his government as an opportunity to prosper and live more dignified lives. Throughout his reign, Claudius was not just an emperor who imposed his power, but a leader who paid attention to the needs of the people, seeking to balance the interests of the upper classes with those of the lower classes. His ability to create a solid popular base was one of the reasons why he managed to rule for over a decade, overcoming many of the political challenges that arose during his reign. Claudius, the often underestimated emperor, found his greatest challenge in the field of heart and family politics. Married 4 times throughout his reign, he became involved in relationships that not only marked his personal life, but also had a direct impact on Roman politics. What seemed to be a search for stability and support within the imperial dynasty turned into fertile ground for betrayals, intrigues, and in the case of his marriages, conspiracies that threatened the empire itself. His first marriage was to the daughter of one of his allies, Placia Urgulanilla, a political union that quickly fell apart, likely due to issues of infidelity and politics. However, it was his second marriage to Messalina that really attracted attention and caused an uproar in the imperial court. Messalina, with her youth and charm, managed to win over Claudius, despite her numerous flaws and devious nature. She was not only ambitious. Messalina had an extraordinary ability to manipulate those around her. Married to Claudius, she became an influential figure within the empire, but her influence was not only political. She used the power of her position to eliminate rivals, ensure the rise of allies, and perhaps most alarmingly, engage in betrayals of such magnitude that they put Claudius' own survival at risk. Throughout the marriage, Messalina orchestrated murders, betrayals, and even conspiracies to ensure that the emperor remained under her control. She even secretly married another man while still being married to Claudius, an act that revealed her complete disregard for marital loyalty. This secret marriage to Senator Gaius Silius was meant to ensure her own rise to power, using the senator's support to replace Claudius if necessary. When the plot was discovered, Claudius was forced to act. Messalina's betrayal could not be ignored, and in an act that shook his emotions and the trust he had in his personal relationships, he ordered her execution. The death of Messalina marked a turning point in his life, leading to a great emotional crisis, while also leaving him vulnerable to manipulation by those around him. However, even after losing his most influential wife, Claudius did not take long to remarry. His next marriage, to Agrippina the Younger, was yet another strategic move that would become his greatest and most tragic alliance. Agrippina, ambitious and relentless, had one goal: to secure the throne for her son Nero. She used Claudius as a springboard for her son's rise, and in a move few would recognize at the time, she began to shape the future of the Roman dynasty by manipulating every aspect of Claudius' life. Agrippina not only won over the emperor with her intelligence and cunning, but also ensured that her son Nero would be adopted and become the heir to the throne. While Claudius, unaware of what was happening, believed that his marriage to Agrippina was providing the necessary stability for the empire, his wife was already manipulating the situation to remove Britannicus, Claudius' biological son, from the line of succession. Agrippina's strategy not only secured Nero's future, but also eliminated any threat to her control. The story of his marriages was a cycle of deceit, power, and manipulation, and in the end, it was his trust in the women in his life that led to his downfall. Each of Claudius' marriages was not just a personal union, but a political battle where he was, many times, a pawn in the hands of those around him. When he died, poisoned by Agrippina, betrayal reached its peak, and Nero rose as emperor, ready to rewrite the history of the Roman Empire with his own vision of tyranny. Claudius, the emperor whose family alliances had been his support, became a tragic example of how power, when mixed with family intrigues and games of interest, can erode the foundations of a reign. The death of Messalina, Claudius' wife, was one of the most dramatic and bloody episodes of ancient Rome, reflecting the tension and betrayal that permeated the imperial court. At first, Messalina seemed to be just another ambitious woman trying to strengthen herself alongside a powerful emperor. However, she turned out to be much more astute and dangerous than anyone could have imagined. When Claudius chose her as his wife, she was young, beautiful, and full of energy. At first, it seemed like a strategic and beneficial union for both. However, over the years, Messalina grew increasingly influential, not just as Claudius' wife, but also as a master manipulator in the political circles of Rome. She was a woman of great ambition and had an unrelenting vision of power, ready to do anything to secure her position, including committing horrendous betrayals. As Messalina established herself as the most powerful woman in the empire, she began weaving a web of conspiracies. But her ambition knew no bounds. In one of the boldest moments of her journey, she started a secret affair with the Senator Gaius Silius, an ambitious man who sought to ascend to the throne. Together, they plotted a coup against Claudius. Messalina envisioned that if she removed the emperor and seized power alongside Silius, she would have total control over Rome. Messalina's extramarital affair was not just a personal betrayal, but also a political scope that risked destabilizing the empire. She began to scheme with other senators, promising them favors and positions in exchange for their support. However, as with all great conspiracies, the truth always finds a way to reveal itself. It was one of the members of the imperial court, possibly one of her own allies, who exposed Messalina's betrayal to Claudius. The emperor, already disillusioned with the intrigues and betrayals surrounding him, was forced to confront his wife about the scandal. Messalina tried to defend herself, claiming that her relationship with Silius was purely a political trust issue. But the evidence was overwhelming. Although deeply shaken by the betrayal, Claudius knew he could not tolerate such an act. To preserve his authority and prevent Rome from being consumed by more intrigue, he gave the order, Messalina must die. This decision was not easy for him, and the death of his wife reflected his own vulnerability. A man who believed he had control, but was always at the mercy of greater forces around him. Messalina was executed without mercy. The fact that she was the mother of 2 of Claudius' children was not enough to spare her tragic fate. Her death marked the end of a tumultuous chapter in Claudius' reign, but also left a mark on the history of Rome, showing the fragility of imperial power and the dangers that arise when personal betrayal is combined with political aspirations. Claudius, still wounded by the loss, was forced to look to the future, aware that more betrayals lurked on the horizon. Messalina's death, while a moment of revenge and justice, also meant the loss of a woman whose cunning and ambition had left an indelible mark on the empire. For Claudius, the lesson was clear. Even those he trusted most could be his greatest enemies. After Messalina's death, Claudius found himself, once again, at a crossroads of power and relationships. The empire, already weakened by internal betrayals, needed stability, and the imperial court demanded a new female figure who could help him restore balance. It was then that he married his niece, Agrippina, the daughter of his sister Antonia, a woman with fierce ambition that proved somewhat insatiable. Agrippina was shrewd and calculating, a woman whose appetite for power knew no bounds. Unlike Messalina, who used her beauty and charms to manipulate, Agrippina was cold and strategic. She knew what she wanted and had no qualms about using any means to achieve it. What drove her was not the simple desire to be the emperor's wife, but to ensure that her son, Nero, would be Claudius' successor, thus taking control of the Roman Empire. Claudius' decision to marry Agrippina was not purely out of love or desire. She had already earned his trust by presenting herself as a decisive and strong woman who could help him maintain stability within the empire. Furthermore, Agrippina was of noble blood and, in a way, could even strengthen the Claudian dynasty, as her son Nero was a direct descendant of Caesar. But what Claudius did not know was that by making this union, he was handing the keys to the empire to a woman who would not hesitate to use the throne as a stepping stone for her own goals. Their marriage was surrounded by intrigue. Agrippina skillfully manipulated Claudius, gaining his trust while simultaneously undermining the possibility of other political figures approaching power. She began to act more and more boldly, forming alliances and eliminating those who opposed her plans. The bond between her and Claudius seemed unbreakable, but in reality, it was a web of manipulation meticulously woven by Agrippina. One of Agrippina's greatest victories in this marriage was the adoption of Nero by Claudius. She convinced the emperor that it was the wisest decision, arguing that Nero, being the son of one of Rome's most respected families, would be a worthy heir capable of ensuring the empire's continuity. Claudius, who was already weary from the loss of his biological son, Britannicus, accepted the proposal, adopting Nero as his son and declaring him his successor. The maneuver was brilliant. Agrippina thus ensured that Nero would be prepared to ascend to the throne, removing any obstacles that could arise in her son's path. She began to have great influence over Claudius, manipulating him into making decisions that favored Nero, even as the emperor himself began to suspect the true nature of his wife's intentions. But, as in many power stories, Agrippina's ambition would eventually lead to her downfall. Although in Claudius' eyes, Agrippina was the ideal wife and mother of the future emperor, seeds of doubt began to be planted. The marriage, seemingly perfect, hid the growing tension between the two. Claudius, even in his advanced age and declining health, began to realize that his position in the empire was increasingly being challenged. Agrippina's manipulation to secure Nero's throne began to stir within him a sense of betrayal and vulnerability. However, as was to be expected in Rome, where power and loyalty were often shaped by ambition and self-interest, Claudius and Agrippina's marriage would not last long. The tragedy of their union would become the beginning of Nero's reign, marked by excess and cruelty. But this story of ascension to power, driven by a manipulative wife, would reveal the dangers the Roman Empire would face in the hands of those who sought power at any cost. With Claudius aging and his health deteriorating, the political situation in Rome grew increasingly tense. Agrippina, now Claudius' wife and manipulator, knew that the moment to secure the throne for her son was drawing near. She had a meticulously crafted plan, and like an experienced chess player, she knew exactly how to move her pieces on the Roman power board. Once Claudius, with his mind disturbed by age, agreed to adopt Nero as his successor, the political situation in Rome shifted. Agrippina, with almost supernatural ability to influence those around her, solidified her son's position as the official heir to the Roman Empire. Claudius, although suspicious of some of his wife's maneuvers, was far from realizing the extent of the control she held over him. Nero, for his part, was an impressionable young man, but with a volatile temper. Since his rise to the line of succession, he found himself playing a relentless game of power, but never with clean hands. Agrippina, shrewd, knew how to use her son to achieve her own ends, shaping him to become the centerpiece of her plans to rule Rome. Meanwhile, Nero, increasingly involved in palace intrigues, was aware of his fate, but did not seem to fully understand the dangers that lay ahead. The relationship between mother and son, which seemed to be one of complicity, quickly deteriorated. Agrippina's power, which had been the driving force behind Nero's rise, began to be threatened by the growing confidence and desire for control of the emperor himself. Nero began to realize that his mother, although still essential for his ascension, was also a threat to his own authority. He didn't want to be merely a puppet in Agrippina's hands. However, Agrippina, with the skill of an experienced leader, was not willing to lose control. She continued maneuvering behind the scenes, maintaining the illusion that she was still the key player in Nero's reign, while secretly preparing the ground for an absolute domination over the empire. She wanted to be more than just the emperor's mother. She desired to be the empress, ruling the destinies of Rome from behind the throne. The tension between mother and son, which had been silent and strategic for some time, now became evident. Nero, in an attempt to assert his authority, began making decisions without consulting Agrippina, and the Roman Empire, in the early years of his reign, saw an erratic and unpredictable emperor, driven by vanity and an insatiable thirst for power. The breaking point finally arrived. Agrippina, who had always believed she was indispensable to the empire, suddenly found herself threatened by the actions of her own son. Nero, who had once seen his mother as an ally and a resource, now perceived her as a potential enemy, a piece in his power game that needed to be removed. However, this move to sever ties with Agrippina, though planned as an act of assertion, would have devastating consequences. Nero's path to absolute power was set, but his victory over Agrippina would come at a cost. The fragile alliance between mother and son was shattered, but the power dynamics within the Roman Empire were far from resolved. Nero's reign, which seemed destined to be an era of absolute domination, would soon reveal itself to be filled with excesses, cruelty, and an unrelenting pursuit of power. As Nero consolidated his power, his relationship with his mother, Agrippina, deteriorated irreparably. The young emperor, now secure in his position, no longer saw the need for his mother to govern Rome. However, he also knew that the woman who had put him on the throne still held significant influence over the empire. Agrippina was a shrewd, manipulative leader, and her presence in the palace was a constant reminder that her son, despite being emperor, was still in her hands, both politically and emotionally. Nero's growing paranoia made him begin to see Agrippina not as an ally, but as an obstacle. He feared that, at any moment, she might turn against him and reclaim the control she had had over the empire in the early days of his reign. Therefore, the only way to ensure his total domination over Rome was to eliminate his mother once and for all. Agrippina, who had always known that Nero's absolute power could be her undoing, began to realize that her position was in jeopardy. The tension between them grew, and every step Nero took toward asserting his own reign seemed aimed solely at distancing himself from his mother. However, she also knew that the Roman political game was ruthless, and that, no matter how much she tried to maintain her influence, control of the empire was shifting from her hands to Nero's. Then came the final conspiracy. Nero, determined to eliminate the source of his insecurity, orchestrated a plan to kill Agrippina. He hired the most loyal servants in his circle, those willing to do the unthinkable in the name of the emperor. The objective was simple but deadly: to ensure that Nero's mother would be erased from history, with no trace of her influence remaining. Agrippina's death was a macabre event disguised as an accident. First, Nero tried poisoning her, but as she seemed to survive the poison, the plan was aborted. Then, in a second, more direct and cruel act, he ordered a structure in her house to be sunk, intending for Agrippina to die in the shipwreck. But surprisingly, she survived the shipwreck, only to be murdered by assassins sent by Nero when she attempted to escape. The act was as brutal as it was symbolic. By killing his mother, Nero not only erased any chance of competition for power, but also sealed his own fate, entering history as an emperor capable of committing immeasurable atrocities to maintain his position. The Roman Empire, already in a state of instability, would be dragged even further into an era of tyranny, excesses, and a government increasingly disconnected from the values that had sustained Rome. As the news of Agrippina's death spread throughout Rome, the imperial court was thrown into shock and uncertainty. Some wondered if Nero would really be able to rule alone, or if his paranoia and cruelty would lead him to self-destruction. But in his mind, the young emperor already knew he had taken the decisive step in his journey toward absolute power. However, the price of this act of betrayal would be high, and the repercussions of his action would soon become apparent. The year 64 AD went down in Roman history as one of the most significant, not only because of the destruction caused by one of the largest fires the city had ever faced, but also due to doubts about Nero's involvement in the disaster. The Great Fire began on the night of July 18th and lasted for 6 days, devastating much of the city, destroying temples, buildings, and homes of thousands of Romans. When the flames were finally controlled, more than half of Rome was in ruins, and many citizens found themselves homeless, destitute, and despondent. The fire generated a wave of panic and chaos, and immediately a cloud of speculation about Nero's responsibility arose. It was widely known that the emperor had plans to rebuild Rome according to his own vision, perhaps with new streets, palaces, and imposing structures. There were also rumors that Nero wanted to build a personal palace, the famous Domus Aurea, on land where the fire had destroyed most of the city. This led many to believe that he might have deliberately set Rome on fire to create an opportunity to seize the devastated land and realize his projects. To deflect accusations and avoid a revolt from the population, Nero sought a scapegoat. He found this in a group already hated by many Romans, the Christians. Although Christianity was a minor and largely unknown sect to many, its followers were often targets of rumors and prejudice. Nero, already known for his brutality, used the fire as an excuse to intensify the persecution of Christians, imprisoning them and, in some cases, condemning them to death in extremely cruel ways, such as being burned alive or attacked by wild animals in the amphitheaters. The accusation that Nero started the fire to satisfy his own desires for power and the city's reconstruction was never proven, but the doubt about his responsibility in the disaster never disappeared. The emperor's image was irreparably tarnished, and the Great Fire became a symbol of his reckless and authoritarian rule. However, Nero, far from being intimidated, used the tragedy as an opportunity to present himself as Rome's great restorer, promising and indeed initiating a reconstruction plan to restore the city to its former glory. However, Nero's vision for Rome's reconstruction did not bring relief to the social and political wounds revealed by the fire. The common people, especially those who had lost their homes, became increasingly dissatisfied with the emperor's lack of resources and attention to their real needs. The city's reconstruction, though ambitious, was marked by opulence and excess, characteristics that became increasingly associated with Nero's reign. While he was rebuilding Rome according to his own ideas, the Roman Empire was drifting away from its former stability. Nero's reign continued to be a mix of cultural excesses and political despair, where his actions to consolidate power and satisfy his deepest personal desires began to erode his relationship with the Romans and his own ability to govern effectively. After the death of Claudius, Nero was proclaimed emperor with the support of his mother, Agrippina, who, hungry for power, became the dominant figure in the early years of her son's reign. Agrippina, shrewd and manipulative, had secured Nero's adoption and rise to the throne by eliminating Britannicus, Claudius's legitimate heir, and positioning her own son as the successor. She used her position to control Nero, taking the reins of government and making decisions in his name. For some time, it seemed that Agrippina's will would govern Rome through the young emperor. However, as Nero grew older and became more self-sufficient, his relationship with his mother deteriorated. Though he initially appeared submissive and dependent, the emperor began to feel the weight of Agrippina's domination and started to distance himself from her influence. This change in attitude did not go unnoticed, and Agrippina's ambition to maintain control over power clashed with Nero's need to assert his authority as emperor. The situation became even more tense when Nero fell in love with a woman named Poppaea Sabina, wife of one of his advisors. The passion between them was intense, but also dangerous to Agrippina's position. She saw her son's involvement with Poppaea as a threat to her own influence, as Poppaea sought to become empress and remove Agrippina from her place of power. Ultimately, the tension reached its peak when Nero, tired of his mother's control, decided to take drastic action to rid himself of her. The conspiracy to eliminate Agrippina began to unfold. In a treacherous move, Nero ordered his mother's assassination. The method chosen for her death was equally cruel. Initially, an attempt to drown her was made, but when Agrippina managed to escape, Nero's assassins returned and killed her violently at her home. Agrippina's death marked the end of an era for Nero. At first, her elimination seemed to guarantee the emperor's freedom and independence, but in reality, this decision had serious repercussions. Although Nero had finally rid himself of his mother, the guilt and rumors surrounding the murder began to haunt him. Agrippina's death also accentuated Nero's volatile and cruel nature, as he was now fully surrendered to his own will, without the constraints or counsel of the maternal figure. From this point on, Nero began making increasingly erratic and unpopular decisions, seeking to satisfy his own desires and interests without regard for the empire's well-being. His rise to power and the ensuing bloodshed marked the beginning of an era of excess, cruelty, and tyranny, and Agrippina, once seen as an ambitious manipulator, came to be regarded by many as a personal tragedy. Her murder, planned by her own son, left an indelible mark on Roman history and was one of the first signs that Nero, far from being the great emperor many had expected, was turning into a despised and tyrannical monarch. Now, without his mother by his side, Nero found himself free to follow his own whims. But this freedom came at a very high cost, and the Roman Empire began to pay a much greater price for the unpredictable and destructive behavior of its new emperor. With Agrippina's death, Nero believed he had finally freed himself from his mother's weight and was ready to rule without her influence. However, what seemed like a victory for the young emperor quickly turned into a spiral of excess, betrayals, and misrule. Without his mother's figure to control his actions, Nero plunged deeper into a chaotic administration, marked by a series of erratic decisions and an increasingly tyrannical style of governance. In the years following Agrippina's death, Nero maintained the appearance of a reasonable ruler, but quickly distanced himself from what could be considered responsible leadership. He surrounded himself with advisors who fed his selfish desires and encouraged his reckless pursuit of power and pleasure. Nero's search for personal satisfaction began to affect the stability of the empire, and the Romans soon realized that the young emperor was more interested in his own amusement than in Rome's well-being. Nero turned his government into a series of excesses. He organized extravagant public games, singing and theater competitions, and became involved in a series of scandals that tarnished his image. Instead of ruling prudently, he indulged in extravagance, spending exorbitantly on personal luxuries and entertainment. This behavior caused widespread dissatisfaction among both the Roman elite and the common people, who began to question Nero's ability to govern the vast empire. While the emperor began making decisions that favored his own interests, there were also moments when his cruelty manifested in a brutal and relentless manner. The persecution of Christians, for example, was one of the most notorious aspects of his reign. Nero blamed them for the Great Fire of Rome in 64 AD and, without hesitation, initiated a series of public tortures against those who refused to abandon their faith. Those deemed enemies or threats to Nero had no chance of surviving his tyranny, and the emperor did not hesitate to purge his own circle, removing anyone he considered an obstacle to his absolute control. However, Nero's decadence was not limited to his personal actions. The empire as a whole began to suffer under his leadership. In 68 AD, a series of rebellions in various provinces of the empire and growing discontent among the Roman troops signaled the beginning of Nero's downfall. Even the Praetorian Guard, which had initially supported his rise to the throne, turned against him, demanding his abdication. The political and military pressure intensified to the point where Nero was declared a public enemy by the Senate. Isolated and without support, he fled Rome and, in a final act of desperation, committed suicide. His death marked the end of an era of chaos and excess, and the fall of an empire that had been left at the mercy of the unchecked ambition of an immature and capricious emperor. With Nero's death, the Julio-Claudian dynasty came to an end. The empire entered a period of instability, known as the Year of the Four Emperors, a time when the struggle for power in the Roman Empire intensified. Despite his death, Nero's legacy, marked by his tyranny and misrule, left an indelible mark on Roman history. He was remembered as one of the worst emperors, and his rise to the throne and his mother's death, Agrippina, continued to reflect the betrayals and manipulations that characterized his journey to power. With Nero's ascension to power, an unrelenting process of erasing Claudius's legacy began. Nero, with his impulsive and destructive nature, not only ignored the reforms implemented by his predecessor, but also sought to rewrite the history of his reign in a way that placed him on a pedestal and erased Claudius's achievements. The Roman Senate, which had always had an ambivalent relationship with Claudius, quickly aligned itself with the new emperor, recognizing in Nero the opportunity to cleanse the image of the previous administration. The administrative reforms that Claudius had implemented, especially those aimed at combating corruption and improving justice in the provinces, were quickly dismantled. The legal system, which he had expanded to be more accessible to ordinary Roman citizens, lost its strength under the new regime. The bureaucracy that Claudius had created to organize the empire more efficiently began to crumble, and the public servants, once committed to efficiency, now served Nero's interests, who preferred opulence and pleasure over responsible governance. Additionally, the major infrastructure projects that Claudius had initiated, such as the aqueducts and the sewage system in Rome, were neglected. Nero, focused on his own image and the luxuries of his reign, diverted resources and attention away from these essential public works. Rome, which under Claudius had experienced a period of prosperity and modernization, found itself back in chaos and disorder, with the city increasingly unable to manage its basic needs. The destruction of Claudius's legacy wasn't limited to administrative policies, but also extended to his place in Rome's history. Nero and his allies in the Senate worked to diminish Claudius's achievements, preferring to build the image of an empire under the control of a young and audacious emperor. Claudius, the underrated and often ignored emperor, was quickly relegated to a secondary figure in the annals of the Roman Empire, and his memory was distorted, with many of his deeds lost in the shadows of Nero's tyranny. Claudius's reign offers a series of valuable lessons about politics, public perception, and power. First and foremost, Claudius's story shows how intelligence and cunning can be more powerful than brute force. Despite his physical limitations and being underestimated, Claudius knew how to use his sharp mind to navigate the complicated political game of Rome. His ability to understand the dynamics of power and manipulate situations in his favor was crucial to his rise to the throne. However, Claudius's story also highlights the dangers of manipulation and conspiracy within a corrupt political system. The rise of Nero to power, facilitated by Agrippina's ambition and Claudius's fragility, is a clear example of how power can be distorted when individuals with their own agendas seek to control the fate of an empire. The betrayals by Messalina and Agrippina were not only personal, but had profound political consequences that affected all of Rome. Finally, Claudius's journey also reminds us of the complexities of leadership. Even a leader with good intentions can be overthrown by both external and internal forces, as were the ones that dominated the end of his reign. The Roman Empire, with its intrigues and thirst for power, showed that even those who appeared most secure in their rule could be easily dethroned. Claudius's legacy, though often overshadowed, still stands as a reminder of the hidden forces that shape history and the role of intelligence, strategy, and resilience in the face of adversity. Claudius was an emperor whose qualities often went unnoticed by his contemporaries. Underestimated for his physical appearance and the limitations imposed by his family, he proved to be an exceptional leader, even though his achievements were overshadowed by Nero's reign. He was a victim of a corrupt political system, where power was more often gained through conspiracies and betrayals than by merit and skill. Still, Claudius managed to rule for over a decade, leaving his mark on ancient Rome. Though manipulated and betrayed, Claudius was also a leader who knew how to adapt and take intelligent actions when needed. He made reforms that improved Rome's infrastructure and implemented administrative changes aimed at ensuring greater justice and stability. His ability to win the loyalty of the Praetorian Guard and his wisdom in governing a major power like Rome, even without being the favorite of the elite, show that he possessed leadership qualities often overlooked. Claudius also teaches us an important lesson about the cost of power. Throughout his life, he was marked by a constant struggle for acceptance, both within his own family and in Roman society. His rise to power, while victorious, was followed by a series of betrayals, both personal and political, which undermined his legacy. His story shows us that in Rome, power wasn't just about ruling. It was about surviving in an unforgiving and treacherous environment, where even the brightest emperors could be forgotten or stripped of their accomplishments. And so, we come to the end of this fascinating journey through Claudius's life and the events that shaped the Roman Empire. His rise, his achievements, and the challenges he faced teach us much about power, betrayal, and the complex political dynamics that governed Rome. Even after his death, his legacy continues to be revisited, showing that, despite the adversities, Claudius was a key figure in Roman history. If you enjoyed this story, leave your comment below. What part of Claudius's journey surprised you the most? And don't forget to like the video to support the channel and share it with your friends. If you haven't subscribed yet, take this opportunity to subscribe and activate the bell so you won't miss the next videos about ancient Rome and other fascinating historical events. See you next time.